Ladies and gentlemen, I want to present a theory of free will that is based on our experience of acting, without saying that for some reason free will cannot be as it seems to be. In particular, I shall not be guided by assumptions about determinism and causality. Let me draw your attention briefly to 6 aspects of the phenomenology of free will. So, features of our experience of our own actions. 6 features of our actions that we experience when we act or consider how we should or could act. Feature number 1, and they're also listed on your handout. Libertarians have often focused on the he could have acted differently. In my view, this is true of many human actions, that the person really could have acted differently, but it is not a necessary feature of being free. Sometimes a person has an obligation, knows clearly that he has it, and has no temptation that could distract him. For example, fortunately, most people have no temptation to kill other people. If Miller has no temptation to kill Jones, then it is still true that he has the power to kill Jones, in the sense that he's strong enough to push a knife into Jones's body, but given his belief that this would be evil and the absence of any temptation to kill Jones, it is not a real possibility that he would kill Jones. This is yet clearer in the case of God. When God has an obligation, then he has the power to act contrary to the obligation, but it is not a real possibility that he will do that. He has it only in a certain limited sense of power or modified sense of power. Therefore, I take it to be a feature of many human actions that the person really could have acted differently, but it is not a necessary feature of being free. What we are getting at when we say that the person could have acted differently is that the action is willed by the agent and is not caused by non-rational features such as brain states, to put that briefly. Feature number 2 of our experience of acting. We experience our actions as originating in us, in the person, where the person has no parts which could be separated from it. It has no parts that could exist on their own. While the body has parts into which the body could be split, the person has no such parts. The various conscious events in the person are not like the events in a car. They are not just connected causally and by having parts in common. They do not involve various parts, but only one thing which has no parts, and that is the person. The origin of the action is in this indivisible center. Feature number 3 of our experience of acting. The experience of the origin of the action in the person entails, I suggest, that the action is not the result of a causal process. It does not have a complete preceding cause. Some libertarians say that a free action does not have a preceding sufficient cause, by which they mean a necessitating cause. I mean that action neither have a necessitating cause nor a complete but stoppable preceding cause. They are not the result of a causal process at all. Actions do involve things which existed before and could in this sense be called causes of the action. My arm existed before I raised my arm and was in this sense a partial cause of the action. But there is no complete preceding cause of my action. That is, before my action, there is no process underway towards my action. But are perhaps some of our actions the result of causal processes? Are actions that we do out of an inclination, perhaps, the result of a causal process? One might think that our free will in such cases consists in the power to veto such processes. But I suggest this is not our experience. Even in actions out of an inclination, we do not experience the body moving on its own with us just having the option to push the brakes. Sometimes I feel a pressure, an inclination, or a desire to do a certain action, but that is different from having a veto power. Feature number 4 of our experience of acting. We experience not only that our actions are not the result of deterministic processes, in the sense of non-probabilistic processes, but I suggest also that our actions are not the results of probabilistic processes, regardless of whether you call such processes causal or not. Many libertarian accounts of free will claim that free actions involve at some stage probabilistic processes. They say that they involve quantum indeterminacy. But I suggest that is also contrary to our experience. If there were quantum indeterminacy in our actions, then there would be a chance of the action occurring during a certain time span, and that chance would be due to certain brain states. But that is contrary to our experience that we are the origin of our actions, and that our actions are not the results of causal processes. If my action were to involve probabilistic processes, then it would not be up to me, but left to chance, what I do and when I do it. That would contradict our experience that we are the origin of our actions, because instead physical processes and chance would be the origin of our actions. When I raise my arm, then I experience that the rising of my arm involves nothing probabilistic. There is no chance and no randomness. And I experience that I set the time of the rising of my arm. Thus, it is not left to a probabilistic process. Feature number 5 of our experience of acting. We experience sometimes that in our actions we have inclinations or desires. Often, one course of action is easier than some alternative course of action. Then we have an inclination towards the first possible action, the one which is easier to us. When we believe that we should not do that action for which we have a desire, then we call a desire a temptation. Feature number 6 of our experience of acting. We experience that sometimes we have reasons to act in one way rather than the other, or within a certain range of actions rather than within a certain other range or outside of that range. Sometimes it's easy to act on a reason that we see. Sometimes, if we have a contravening inclination, it is hard to act on a reason. Sometimes it is so hard that we have practically no chance to act on the reason. Someone who is addicted to gambling can hardly resist the temptation to gamble away his just received salary. But at some moments he might be able to get help and find a strategy to become free from the addiction in the long run. So although we experience our actions as being neither the results of non-probabilistic processes nor of probabilistic processes, we do experience these two kinds of motives for certain action, inclinations and reasons. Now I want to spell out what these 6 elements of our experience of action mean for our actions for how our actions come to occur. What causes do free actions have? Bodily free actions involve a kind of causal process that leads to the intended result. For example, the rising of the arm. It involves my muscles and my brain and whatever else. But I suggest if the action is free, then it has a beginning. That process has a beginning. One stage of the action process has no complete preceding cause. More precisely, one part of this initial stage of the action process has no complete preceding cause. This part of the initial stage may be just a property or a property change, for example, a movement or the firing of a neuron. The property bearer of this property change may exist before and therefore is a partial cause of the initiating event, but there is no complete preceding cause of the initiating event. If an action is free, then it involves an initiating event that has no preceding cause. It is neither the result of a probabilistic process nor the result of an indeterministic process. Our experience of free will is correct only if the occurrence of the initiating event is up to us. It must occur through the agent and not through a preceding event. The acting brings about this event, not in the sense that the acting is a preceding cause of this event, but in the sense that the event occurs through the agent's choice. Therefore, I call such an event, this initiating event, a choice event. That means that it is an event that has no preceding cause, but occurs through an agent's action. So there are at least three ways how an event can come about. It can be the result of a non-probabilistic process, it can be the result of a probabilistic process, or thirdly, it can be a choice event. Free actions involve choice events. In my view, all actions involve choice events. I leave open here whether the choice events that initiate the action process are mental or physical. If they are brain events, then we are not aware of them. That is possible. We intend to bring about a certain result through the action, and there is a hierarchy of what we do in order to achieve this result. In order to water the flowers, I open the door in order to go to the flowers. And in order to open the door, I move my arm in a certain way. But I'm not moving my arm by doing something else, I just move my arm. This is an intentionally basic action. When I do that, however, I'm bringing about a choice event in my brain on the account that I'm considering, and I'm not aware of this brain event, although it is the choice event. If I try to move my arm, then that brain event occurs without me knowing anything about it. An alternative, however, would be that the mental event, which we can call trying or a volition, is the choice event, which then is an event cause of brain events. I don't take a view on which account is true here. Many libertarian theories say that an action is free if it has no sufficient cause. They see this condition to be fulfilled if the action is the result of a probabilistic process because there is quantum indeterminacy in the brain. Compatibilists respond that this reduces control and therefore reduces freedom. In my view, here the compatibilist is right. The mere absence of a sufficient cause does not make an action free or doesn't make it freer in any sense. It is also not enough to add to this agent causation in Roderick Chisholm's sense. There is a quotation in the handout which I read. Chisholm writes about what he means by agent causation. In Chisholm's view, an action always involves agent causation, and a free action is one where the action has no sufficient cause. And then he explains in a later writing what he means by agent causation. The philosophical question is not, or at least it shouldn't be, the question whether or not there is agent causation. The philosophical question should be, says Chisholm, rather the question whether agent causation is reducible to event causation. Thus, for example, if we have good reason for believing that Jones did kill his uncle, then the philosophical question about Jones as cause would be, can we express the statement, Jones killed his uncle, without loss of meaning into a set of statements in which only events are said to be causes and in which Jones himself is not said to be the source of any activity? That, in my view, now my response is that we cannot express the statement Jones killed his uncle in a statement in which Jones is not said to be the source of activity is compatible with the action, in fact being just the result of a probabilistic or non-probabilistic process. In that case, in my view, there would be no free will. The denier of free will and the compatibilists say that also when we say that someone brought something about, everything that happens is the result of a probabilistic or a non-probabilistic process. That account, I suggest, is insufficient for saying what free will is. The irreducibility of action statements is somehow linked to our experience of free will, but in my view, this experience is evidence for choice events. But Chisholm claimed that the irreducibility of action statements plus the absence of a sufficient cause make an action free. He denied a free action as one for which there is no sufficient. He defined free action as one for which there is no sufficient causal condition. To this, I object that it leaves open that the action is the result of a probabilistic process. In that case, the action is not free because the action occurs by chance and the agent lacks control over it. Instead, a free action is one in which there is an event that has no preceding cause, but whose occurrence is due to the agent, and that is what I call a choice event. How does this theory fulfill the 6 features of our experience of acting? First, the choice events, for many of actions, there are alternative possibilities. About an action to which there was an alternative which was equally good, or towards which I had some inclination, it is true to say that I could have acted differently. Not only in the sense that that sort of action was within my capacities, but in the sense that it was really possible that I would make the world go another course than I actually did. I could have produced another choice event instead of the one that I did produce, or I could have produced no choice event at all during the time in question. With the choice event theory, we can also say what makes those actions free in which there are no real alternative possibilities. For example, actions of God, by God, which he is obliged to do. It is the fact that they involve choice events which makes them free, even in the absence of real alternative possibilities. Second feature of experience, choice events originate in the agent. If action processes involved only events that are the results of probabilistic or non-probabilistic processes, then actions would not be free and they would not be as they seem to us. They would originate entirely in these processes. Third feature, the choice event theory does justice to the experience that our free actions are not the result of non-probabilistic processes. Fourth, and the same is true for probabilistic processes. And the fifth feature is more complicated. How can choice event theory do justice to the experience of inclinations and desires? If actions involve choice events, how can one choice be easier than an alternative? One might think that if we give in to an inclination, then the action is caused by preceding events. Perhaps such actions exist. If they do, we can veto the process and resist the inclination by bringing about a certain choice event. But it is more plausible that no actions are the result of a causal process. If we give in to an inclination, then we have the impression that we can resist the inclination and have control over whether and when we can give in. That suggests that the action is not the result of a process, because a process would determine the time of the action. Rather, physical states do bring about inclinations. That's now my view. On my view, physical states bring about inclinations. They make some actions easier and some alternative actions hard. If the body is in certain states, then some choice events are easy and some are hard. If I have not drunken anything for a whole day, then drinking is easy and resisting is hard. But I do not have the impression that my body is moving on its own. It is not as if my body is moving like a robot and I can just counteract the movement and try to have a little influence on that movement. It is not as if I'm in a car with an autopilot where I just have the option to push the brakes. Even actions in which we give in to an inclination, we do not experience in this way. Sixth feature. Sometimes we see reasons for doing a certain action, and sometimes we act on certain reasons. We have the impression that reasons tell us what we should do, that we should do a certain action or act within a certain range of possible activity. Or rather, the situation requests me to act in a certain way. I believe that the action requires a certain action from me. Seeing a reason is to believe that I should do the action, or that the action is good, or that there is something in favor of acting in this way. Inclinations, by contrast, involve no such beliefs. We experience also actions that are done upon a reason as not being the result of a process. I experience that I act upon a reason. In some cases, I experience that I act upon a reason against an inclination. The relation between a reason and the choice event is not event causation, but a special relation. It is dissimilar from all other relation. It is a relation on its own, the relation of acting in the light of a certain reason. I conclude that all actions involve choice events, and that this is what our experience of acting suggests. There are two main reasons why people reject or do not even consider the choice event theory. The objection that it is incoherent or meaningless, and second, the belief in determinism. Let me indicate how I would respond to these objections. Is the idea of choice events incoherent or ununderstandable? Can we make sense of it? Galen Strawson has put the incoherence objection in two forms, which are, I think, on your handout. First version, quote, when you act, you do what you do because of the way you are. From that he derives that it can't be what I call choice events. Second way he puts it, or the second version, one cannot be a causa sui, one cannot be the cause of oneself. Consider the first version, you do what you do because of the way you are, as Strawson says. If that means that your actions are the result of a causal process, then that is contrary to our experience. We experience action as something different from processes and event causation. There is no reason to believe that the only way how an event can come to occur is as being the result of a process. Occasionalists believe that all events occur through action, either divine or human. It's only relatively recently that philosophers came to believe that the only way how an event can come to occur is through a process. Our experience suggests that there is both event causation and agent causation as I've described it, and both are coherent. Strawson's second version is equally unconvincing. He says that, quote, one cannot be a causa sui. Being the cause of oneself is not exactly the right description of choice events. A choice event is an event that has no preceding or cause but occurs through an action. There is nothing here that is the cause of itself. The choice event is brought about through the agent, so the relation between him and the agent is different from event or process causation. The objection from determinism was already put forward by Thomas Hobbes in 1654. For him, it amounts to the idea of free will being contradictory. First, he argues in that argument that if an event occurs, then its cause was complete, otherwise it would not have occurred. Then he continues to reason if it was complete, then it was also sufficient. And he continues, if it was sufficient, then the effect could not but follow. And Hobbes' conclusion is, I quote, that ordinary definition of a free agent, namely that a free agent is that which, when all things are present, which are needful to produce the effect, can nevertheless not produce it, implies a contradiction and is nonsense, being as much as to say, the cause may be sufficient, that is to say necessary, and yet the effect shall not follow. End of quote. In another text, he formulates the view which we call determinism today, all events have their necessity in things antecedent. Hobbes' obvious mistake is that he equates being sufficient with necessitating. That an event occurred entails at most that something brought it about that was strong enough to bring it about. Something sufficient in the sense of enough, but not in the sense of necessitating. It is impossible that an event necessitates a later event, in my view, because it is always true that after or during the first event occurred, something could have prevented the occurrence of the second event. So there is no reason here to believe that all events are necessitated by preceding events, and in my view it is even impossible that an event is necessitated by preceding events. Today the argument from determinism is often put in terms of not in terms of necessity, but it starts from the idea that a state of the universe plus the laws of nature entail all the other events. The laws of nature are identified on this account with the equations of motion, and the equations of motion are interpreted as predictions of what will actually happen. If one day we will find the one unifying theory of physics, then we will have an equation of motion which, together with a description of one state of the universe, entails all other events on this assumption. If that were true, then there would be no choice events. There also would be no miracles, and furthermore, physics would have shown this. On this view, the experiments that support the comprehensive equations of motion also show that there are no choice events and no divine interventions. The possibility of probabilistic processes at the quantum level is taken into account usually by making the equations of motion probabilistic. This still entails that there are no choice events and no divine interventions, because a choice event is neither the result of a non-probabilistic process or the result of a probabilistic process. My response to this objection from determinism is that equations of motion may not be interpreted as predictions of what will happen come what may. Consider some physical state of affairs, S1 at time t1. The law of gravitation, for example, will tell us which gravitational forces there is in that situation, S1. Other laws will tell us that there are certain other forces. You can also formulate an equation of motion that takes into account all the forces that there are in that situation S1. Now, is that equation of motion rightly interpreted as what will happen? As a prediction of what will happen? Not if there are other things acting on what will happen. There may be other things outside of S1 that will affect what will happen after T1. If that is the case, then the equation of motion that takes into account everything in S1 is not rightly interpreted as a description of what will happen. Philosophers have tried to do justice to this by adding ceteris paribus clauses to equations of motion. The idea is that the equation of motion applies if the circumstances are the same. But the same to what? Whether the S1 equation of motion is a description of the future does not depend on whether the circumstances are the same than in other cases of states of affairs of that type, states of affairs that are similar to S1. Rather, it depends on whether there is something else affecting what will happen after S1. So instead of ceteris paribus clauses, we need a simple proviso that nothing else is acting. So the equation of motion that takes into account everything in S1 entails a prediction of the form S1 will be followed by S2 if nothing is counteracting S1. S1 will be followed by S2 if nothing is counteracting S1. So in order to make a prediction, we need to look at all the factors that are affecting what will happen. Now, there is no reason that only event causes can affect what will happen. In many situations, that assumption is justified. For example, when we predict a solar eclipse, then there are no humans or animals who are strong enough to move planets. And from the past, we know that God usually does not intervene in that way, although it is possible that one day he might do that. If God in the past had often visibly moved around planets by intervention and prevented solar eclipses, then the situation would be different, but he has not done that. And for the probability of such an intervention, the laws of nature are irrelevant. It only depends on our past experience of the action and character of God. That depends entirely on our investigation of what things there are in the situation. The behavior of the physical things can be known through the laws of nature. The behavior of the agents who could intervene can be known to some degree by investigating what they've done in the past. Coming back to choice events in human actions, we are not justified in assuming that there are no choice events in human brains. First, the laws of nature do not rule out such events. They do not even make them improbable. There are two ways how to find out whether there are choice events in human brains. First, perhaps brain researchers could discover them. John Eccles claimed to have found evidence for what I call choice events. I cannot judge whether there is strong such evidence. And second, our experience of acting provides evidence for the existence of choice events. And our knowledge about the human body suggests that they would be in the brain. I conclude that our experience of acting suggests and makes it rational to believe that there are choice events and that the usual objections against such a view of free will are unfounded. Thank you.
Professor von Wachter's point of departure is the phenomenology of free agency. He wants to answer the question, what do our free actions seem to be like? And his main claim with regard to this phenomenology is that our free actions seem to be initiated by us. In other words, the event initiating a free action, von Wachter calls it the initiating event, is up to us. It is brought about by us. We are the ones doing the initiating. Now my question to von Wachter is this. What happens after the initiating event? By whom or what is the rest of the action caused? As we have just seen, the initiating event is up to the agent. It is brought about by the agent. But what about what happens next? Is the rest of the action brought about by the agent as well? Or is it rather brought about by the initiating event? It seems to me that von Wachter tends towards the second option. His emphasis on the claim that the agent's causal work consists in initiating the action suggests that the causal work after the initiating event is not done by the agent herself, but rather by the initiating event. The initiating event, so it seems, brings about the rest of the action. The agent herself only brings about the first part of it. The latter part of the action may, of course, be said to be indirectly caused by the agent. Its direct cause, however, seems to be the initiating event. And this creates the impression that the rest of the action is not up to the agent. Von Wachter thus apparently proposes what might be called a billiard ball or domino model of agent causation. In this model, the agent initiates a chain of events, but only the first event in the chain is brought about by the agent herself, whereas the latter events are brought about by prior events. The agent sets in motion the chain of events, so to say, but once the chain is in motion, it is no longer the agent, but the events that do the causal work. The following quotation from Chisholm illustrates this model quite succinctly. Quote, "We may say that the hand was moved by the man, but we may also say that the motion of the hand was caused by the motion of certain muscles. And we may say that the motion of the muscles was caused by certain events that took place within the brain. But some event, and presumably one of those that took place within the brain, was caused by the agent and not by any other events." Unquote. So in Chisholm's model, the agent brings about the brain event, which in turn causes the motion of muscles. And the motion of muscles then causes the motion of the hand. There is, however, no direct causal connection between the agent and the motion of the hand. The direct cause of the motion of the hand is the motion of muscles. In other words, another event. In my critique of the billiard ball or domino model, I will focus on one particular problem, namely the tension between this model and the phenomenology of agency that von Wachter repeatedly emphasizes. For it seems to me that when we investigate our experience of acting, we find that our actions are not just initiated by us. We don't just start them. Instead, our actions also seem to be sustained and upheld by us from beginning to end. We appear to be active throughout them, not just at their temporal start. This is brought out in the following quotation from Mumford and Anyum. Quote, "For the raising of your arm to be an act, any willing must occur with the raising. At the same time, any decision prior to the raising cannot be the cause of the raising. The cause must continue to have some existence as long as does the effect. Your deliberate raising of your arm must continue all the way until the arm is as fully raised as you want." Unquote. It seems to me that Mumford and Anyum's emphasis on the continued activity of the agent throughout her action captures an important feature of the phenomenology of agency that is missing in von Wachter's account. It may not be easy to account for this feature in metaphysical terms. This, I believe, has to do with the influence the human tradition still has on our thinking about causation. For according to this tradition, the temporal priority of cause over effect is part of the definition of causation. However, if the phenomenology of agency is taken seriously, then we have support for the claim that there are at least some instances of causation in which the cause is not temporally prior to the effect. A different concept of causation, free of any human commitments, seems needed in order to make sense of this phenomenology. Hints at what this concept may look like can be found in Hornsby, Stewart, and most recently, Wong. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a good objection, and it requires me to clarify exactly that. I think it's quite right what Mr. Wehinger said, that that my view as I presented it does suggest or does imply or could convey the picture that it's the initiating and then it runs on its own. And one mistake I made is, or misleading in what I said, is the notion of an action process. And I think I should fix that and not use the term action process or explain that it's not a process that is a causal process as we usually know it. It's not the action process which I said leads, for example, to the rising of the arm. It does involve the muscles and nerves and brain and whatever else. But it's not a causal process in the sense of event causation. It's not a causal process that would run on its own. I think that's what Mr. Wehinger rightly pointed out, and I think I have to fix that. So, and it's true that the choice event must continue. So it's not an action process. The action process isn't a process that is running on its own. But the choice event has to occur continuously over a certain time. I mean, it might begin a bit earlier before anything moves, but then at least if it's an extended action, which most actions are, then the choice event has to continue during the action, during the rising of the arm, for example. And together with physical things or with other physical things, then it is the moving of the arm. It involves the arm, it involves muscles, but that is what's going on. So I have to fix my theory by saying that the choice event occurs, of course, over a span of time and usually during the whole action, in the case of bodily movement, and together with physical events. It may be an event that involves physical things, so it can be a property or a property change of a physical thing, but the choice event continues over the time span of the action and together with other physical things, with the other parts of what I called misleadingly action process, does constitute the action, or in this case, the movement. So thank you for this good response, and I think I need to take that into account.
Could we say, according to your account, that this relates to the relationship between the choice event and the action? Could we say that the choice event occurs only as a consequence of an agent bringing about an action, such that even if the choice event were a mental event, which you leave open, it would be sort of a byproduct of the action? Could we say that according to your theory?
It's only a sense in the byproduct, only if the choice event is a brain event. It's a byproduct of our, for example, trying to raise the arm. So it's a byproduct in that sense, but not temporally after the action, of course, and only in the sense of what we are aware of. But causally, it still has its initiating role. But the point is well taken that if it's a conscious event, then it's a byproduct in that sense.
Your theory would say that the agent sort of directly brings about the action. So one could qualify it as a non-causal account, perhaps?
Whether it's okay, I indicated a comment, I indicated a certain point about agent causation. I do call it agent causation, but only with reservations, because people, in particular Chisholm, who was pretty much constitutive of that term, used it in a different sense. At least the later Chisholm, interestingly, the early Chisholm, which I think Tim O'Connor also worked out in his thesis, the earlier Chisholm is much closer to my view. So I might call it agent. I think it is adequate to call it agent causation, and one has to add that that's just a broader sense of causation, but still an adequate one. It's adequate because it's within the idea of bringing something about. So it's not as broad as the Greek notion of idea. I think it's an adequate notion of causation. One just needs to say it's not event causation, but I use it with this reservation because it's the agent is rightly called in this sense the cause of the choice event.
And I think it's also involved in the issues raised by the reply to you. It looks as though, if we're going to talk about choice events being brought about through the agent,
yes,
that the agent is exercising what looks like a kind of power. That's why so many people want to think of it as agent causation, because causation is a very familiar kind of productive power. And if it is a kind of power, then it's one that could operate through the process of an action so that you're directly involved as the power bearer and you don't just kick the thing off and leave the rest up to nature. But then that's going to give rise to the question, if you're happy with this idea of power, and you might not be, what kind of power would be involved? So I suppose my question is there a kind of power involved in your idea of a choice event? And what form does it take? And if not, then this looks much more unlike causation than even your remarks might have suggested.
I think it's rightly called a power. That's why I said also before that it's adequate to call it a kind of causation. But I think explaining what kind of power it is, I would just say what I did say. I would just say it's what happens in a choice. I mean, I would describe how we act, and then we try to act, and in that process, we bring about a choice event, and they seem to us the action seems to us as I explained. But I see no commitment in addition to what I said about the causing about the choice events by saying that it is a power. I think I see nothing else there. I mean, of course, I want to distinguish it firmly from physical causation, which I think involves no powers. At least, I think the notion of power is much more adequately applied to agents than to physical things. And I wouldn't liken any physical causation, process causation, to agent causation. No, it's the picture is true that there are causal processes and they don't involve on causation I reject a power view because it's too substance focused. I mean, it's close to my view, but it's too substance focused. So yes, there is power and more clearly so in a more clear sense than in physical causation.
I wondered whether you could allow that there be antecedent factors that make a choice objectively more likely if we don't think of so long as we don't think of them as sort of triggering causes of the choice. That is, I take it you don't want that. You don't want there to be these sort of motivational inclination factors, whatever, that sort of trigger the event that is the choice. But so could we not have non-triggering antecedent factors that make it objectively more or less likely that I choose as I do? What's your deep theoretical reason for opposing that idea?
I think we need them as factors, but they are inclinations and reasons, but they need to be distinguished from process causation. That's my point. For the reasons of control and for the reasons of the timing, at least for.
Okay, could I just follow up,
yes,
just
please.
For clarity of the view? So will you allow that these such factors make certain choices at certain times more likely than they otherwise would have been absent those factors?
Yes, I think. Okay. That's how we tell if a friend of us is offered a bribe. In some cases, we have no clue, and it's pretty. He might or he might not. We say, I don't know his character very well, or some days he's like that, and other days he's like that. But for other friends, I would say he would never do that. And to the contrary, too, for some friends, or perhaps not friends, I would think he would certainly accept that. So yes, I have to accept such factors, and I try to accommodate it, but resist it or reject the way of making them event causes. I mean, it's a kind of metaphysical cost by introducing these extra relationships, and others have tried to take that into account by making it more like event causation, and the compatibilist goes the whole way that way. But my alternative that I'm offering, I'm telling the compatibilist, you're quite right with quite a lot, but just consider other ways how things can come to occur. Then the picture looks different. Then the compatibilist motive becomes one for my kind of view.
I would like to ask you to clarify a few notions and concepts. So you distinguished agent causation from what you called more like deterministic causation or probabilistic causation. I guess you mean by deterministic and probabilistic causation, deterministic or probabilistic physical causation.
Yes.
But there are many options of what possible causes could be. And concerning probabilistic causation, I think you think mainly of quantum indeterminacy.
Yes.
But that's a prime example of contextual stochasticity, because a measurement process, it's the measurement apparatus that defines the possible events. So there is a lot of top-down and contextual influence. So to me, your notions are not completely clear. And I wonder whether one could really make this clear distinction. So you talked about humans, but what about animals? And if you go down to bacteria, they do this tumbling motion. So they run in one direction, then they tumble and swim in a different direction. Is that a choice by the bacterium, or is it probabilistic? So I see a continuum. I cannot see this clear distinction.
Okay, the first one, more could be said about probabilistic causation, but I don't need to say more because I say it mustn't be there in action. Otherwise, it's not free action, or at least if it's significant, it's not free action. So I don't need to say more about how probabilistic causation takes place and what it depends on. But your second point, sorry, your second point was what?
Continuum for the animals.
Oh, the animals, yes. I mean, I assume that animals are acting and that they have souls. I mean, I didn't speak about souls, but I think, yes, animals produce choice events. And when you come down to certain bacteria or insects, we discussed that over dinner yesterday, I think it's an open question to me, and I would be keen to find the answer, whether they are more like computers or whether they are agents with souls and choice events. So I think that's an open question. But yes, I would say clearly some animals produce choice events. And there is nothing wrong with that. It's just such a dominating view since Descartes that everything occurs through processes. I think that's just a very wrong picture.
Thank you, Daniel, for this wonderful, very stimulating paper. I've got lots of things to say, and I'm not going to say them all, but I'd like to focus on your response to what you call the contemporary objection on the second page of the handout. If I heard you correctly, you rejected what you called ceteris paribus conditions, but in doing that, you rolled together two kinds of situations that I think you might want to keep distinct. One of them had to do with what I would call failure of causal closure. There is some other act or agent involved besides the purely physical conditions being set up. The other had to do with merely similar circumstances. And the reason that I think you might want to draw a distinction between those is that even under what we could call a purely physically deterministic system, similarity gets to be a very tricky notion in nonlinear dynamical systems, right? So if I am running water from a faucet, I turn it on only a little bit, the flow is very clear and laminar, and I turn up the speed just a small bit more, and suddenly I've got turbulence, I've lost the laminarity of the flow. Very small differences have sudden transition boundaries, and that's quite a different thing from a different agents acting. And in the latter case, where there's an agent acting that wasn't taken account of in the system, I think you might actually want to parse that in terms of ceteris paribus conditions. But I would just make a distinction between the two of those.
The latter, when I said similarity, I did mean exact similarity. I just avoided the term same type or so, but because time would have breadth. Actually, that's what I wanted to say. It's exact similarity, because the type would be kind of arbitrary or hard to choose. No, it's exact similarity, which I meant. Now, and on ceteris paribus, I would say ceteris paribus don't capture what you need to get at, because the circumstances don't matter. All you need, there can be many other circumstances, and a positive claim about what there is the case is not enough to warrant the prediction. What you need is the claim that nothing else is acting. And you need that for every prediction, for one that takes account only one force, as well as for one which takes into account the whole universe, if we have the big final equation of motion. Even then, I'm suggesting it's the same situation where you need to add to a prediction that is derived from an equation of motion the clause, if you express this in prose as a prediction, that nothing else is acting. So it's occurring if nothing else is acting on the scenario which changes it. So I think ceteris paribus clauses don't get you what you need at all.
Just a historical question. Your account sounds to me similar to C.S. Lewis's view in Miracles, so you may comment on this if there are links. And another question for clarification, you distinguished several times between action and free action. So what would be a non-free action, but including choice events?
I mean, I basically just considered all actions to be free and all involving choice events. I mean, we could discuss details or special cases, but I only spoke about all actions and free actions and ones involving choice events. I made no distinction between various kinds of actions. And the first point, yes, it is similar to C.S. Lewis's insight there. He says the law doesn't apply there because it's not closed. But there is a problem when it comes to the theory of laws. I think we shouldn't say that the laws do not apply to these cases, because they do apply. And one way to put it is to say they say which forces there are in that situation. And the forces are still there if whoever, God for example, counteracts. So I reject this account if it's an account of laws of nature which then limits its applicability to the cases where nothing else is acting. I would say, on the one hand, if you take the force formulation, you have to say they apply to all scenarios. If a law describes that there is a force in a certain kind of situation, that's true always and everywhere, and even God couldn't change it. But there is a force, and God could just bring about a different event by counteracting the force. And then equations of motion are so that either one interprets them as predictions, and then one needs the proviso, but then they're not the law themselves. But the prediction isn't the law. The prediction is just one thing that's calculated from the law, and the prediction has this limited applicability, but the law applies broadly. And I also have an account how to apply the equation of motion broadly, but I explain that some other time.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel, for your talk. My question is in the same line as one of the respondents, but I'll try to push it a bit further because you have already sort of responded to that. It seems to me that your account, just like much of the contemporary free will debate, has sort of a diachronic bias in its very perspective towards a problem. That even in your title, the question is how agents can initiate causal process and then or followed by other things. Whereas I think if we take the image of human beings as created in the image and likeness of God seriously, it means that human beings are not metaphysically primarily part and parcel of the created order, but unconceal in some way or other the very relation of the creator vis-a-vis creation, and that our first relation towards the created order is not one of changing or initiating causal processes, but having the same relation towards the created order as the creator. And in that sense, that would give us a synchronic perspective of causation and of acting in the created order in the same way that God does. And the first question would not be whether or not we are acting in one way or another, but whether or not we are creating or co-creating with God or not. And creating or co-creating doesn't change any causal processes. It's not an intervention in the causal processes. It's a synchronic. It's a synchronic perspective that might be indeed in the sense of adding a certain power to the series of powers that are operating diachronically without harming the diachronic order.
I agree to the extent that agents can bring about, human agents as well as animal agents are similar to God in the respect of the ability to bring about choice events, and then of course, and doing so for reasons, the humans, not the animals, and doing so for reasons. That's the similarity, but I don't follow the other similarities because, one distinction is, of course, that God sustains the physical things and we don't, and we can't bring about physical things. We can only bring about certain changes at physical things. And I think we are part of the created order in clear sense that we are here and we are acting on the created order and are also affected by it, in particular through the inclinations and through having a body to which we are limited and linked. So I don't quite follow your similarities quite as far. I think it is right to say that humans and animals are part of the created order because they don't sustain the other things. They find themselves in that situation, whereas God sustains it, and if he were to intervene, does so sort of in addition. With one hand he sustains, and with the other he intervenes. That's not the situation of humans and animals. So these distinctions I would then point to.
Yeah, thank you very much. In your phenomenological description of acting, you mentioned inclinations and reasons. And later on, when you talked about solar eclipse and God's possibility to intervene, you said that we know, of course, our experience, our knowledge of the acting and character of God, that he usually doesn't, he could interfere, but he usually doesn't. And of course, this inclination and reason gives room for sort of a drama between the two, which result in an action of the agent. What inclinations and what reasons come to pass to bring the action in motion. What would you say, what could we answer if we say one could add to inclinations and reasons something like convictions and virtues of the agent, also as some given parameters, if you want, as a description of the agent, similar to the character of God and the experience of his acting before, and then say, having this set of the character of the agent and the inclinations and the reasons, the character, including the virtues, that is sort of determining the result of the decision, the action, in this description of the state at the moment of the decision.
The convictions, the relevant convictions are the reasons. So the beliefs in the reasons are the relevant convictions. I mean, of course, you need other beliefs too about how to achieve what you want to achieve, but the convictions are in the picture, and of course the virtues are a disposition to act in a certain way, or how you've formed yourself in a certain way, and part of them are probably also the beliefs. Yes, in a certain way, as I admitted in the talk, they can determine a certain action, and a divine action or a human action, and in some scenarios this has the consequence that there is actually no real openness which action will happen. Then they do determine it, but not determine it in the causal sense of process causation, not in the sense of causation which in particular is governed by laws of nature. So the compatibilist here, that's where I depart from the compatibilist. The compatibilist says, well, there are these what you call determining factors and what I called reasons and inclinations. He says we've got to connect them to the actions, and the only thing we have is process causation, so that's it. And I'm saying, yes, they are connected, and in various cases to a different degree of openness, but we must posit different relations than event causation.
I found your idea of choice events very stimulating, and this is a new proposal in your paper, one of the new proposals. But there might be some questions. I stumble a little bit on this sentence on your handout. It occurs through the agent in or through his action. There might be the question: is when this choice event is brought into reality, is it still up to the agent to control it? Is it still part of the action? So if I produce a choice event to raise my arm, isn't it up to me that I can control it up to the end, until the arm is raised? And then there would be a different in this in or through his action. Is it some sort of thing which is beyond my choice to act, or is it all still in it? And the second worry would be, if you introduce this choice event, wouldn't it be making difficult the distinction between, we have in all today that something occurs to me when I have a reflex, a bee stitches me, and it occurs to me that my arm raises or to bring it away. And this is different from a deliberate action. So if you introduce this choice event, this clear distinction between deliberate action, raising my arm, and just occurring the event of a reflex that my arm is raised because there is an insect stitching me.
I agree that the notion of occurring doesn't quite fit choice events. That's right. I just used it in order to express the points that there are various ways how something can, let's say, come into being, how an event can come into being, I could have said instead. I just wanted to bring out that point in order to make my claim that it needn't be through a process, but can also be through an agent, so that the event is a choice event. The other point about the action also, what I mean is that the agent, it's up to the agent to raise his arm or not to raise the arm. If he tries to raise his arm and does so until the arm is up, then he did bring about the choice event, and the choice event then has no preceding sufficient cause or no full sufficient cause. It's not the result of a causal process. So the choice event, you can say, occurs in the action, and it's the if it's still under the control of the act. yeah, why not? Why should it not be under the control of the agent? Because if he stops moving his arm, stops raising his arm, which he can do at any time, then the choice event also stops at that time. He can't change it afterwards, but I see no problem there.
As you know, the enemies of agent causation are many, and an objection that I myself have heard, I myself am an agent causationist, this agent causation, this bringing about of an event by an agent in an irreducible way, this is totally mysterious. It's entirely incomprehensible. What would you answer to this objection? And I have also heard it with a theological twist. Having agents bringing about events in a irreducible way is equal to attributing to human beings the creative power of God.
There is truth in the latter. I mean, yes, it is so. I mean, that's the point. And that's, of course, a reason why non-dualists or non-theists may be more reluctant to do it. Is, of course, a universe is simpler, which just contains of physical things, and where the only way how something occurs is through physical processes. That is a simpler universe, but it just doesn't seem to be the actual universe. We discover these other things. We discover agency, and I suggested that agency leads to, if we reason further, leads to this kind of, assuming these kinds of events. And then, and it is a very fundamental similarity between God and humans, that they can both act and bring about choice events. And in fact, I've written about choice events with God, which ones they are. Now, the mysteriousness one, I think, is very interesting, or at least widespread. Of course, it's not clearly spelled out what it means. That's, of course, many things we say are not spelled out very clearly. But one thing I would respond is what's clear about, what's non-mysterious about causation at all? I mean, what's non-mysterious about an event bringing about another event, even a later event? I mean, how can, Roman Ingarden pointed out, how can one thing at one time, which is one sphere of being, impact on what's occurring at a later time? So I would say the connection that there is between an event cause and its effect is not at all clearer than the connection between the agent and the choice event, and the latter even is less mysterious because we experience it all the time. We just should move away from the idea that, I mean, people who say that have a fixed worldview, and in this case it's the worldview of determinism, or at least it's all up to causal processes, and they trust this philosophical worldview more than their own experience. That's how many false pictures in philosophy come about. And then I say, forget about all that philosophy and just look at what you experience, what it seems to you, and then I think you will find that agent causation is even less mysterious than event causation.
Very good.
A small point about the temporal relation of cause and effect, which was raised both by you and by the respondent. I think we must do justice to the temporal relation of the act of agency, however you describe it, and the effect. And I think the thing to say is that the effect must begin at a time after the beginning of the causal act, and that the effect must end no later than the end of the causal act. That is to say, the causal act must last as long, must begin before the beginning of the effect and end no later than the end of the effect. And this is made very natural if you think of all events as taking time, as lasting for periods and not as occurring at instants. My own view is that everything that occurs at an instant can be analyzed in terms of their happening over periods. But in any case, if you say that the cause must begin before the beginning of the effect, that does justice to the priority of cause to effect. But as you rightly say, for any interesting effect, the cause has to continue a bit, and it has to continue at least until the end of the effect, because if it stopped before the end of the effect, then what caused the going on in the last period? Well, something in the effect itself did. And there is, on the other hand, anything that the cause did after the end of the effect can't have made any difference. So they both end at the same time, but the cause has to start first.
I agree with that concerning event causation, but about agent causation, I would say that the event cause has no preceding cause at all, because there is no dated event which could be the cause of it. The agent perhaps thought about it or had an inclination, and then the agent just did it. The agent must have existed before.
Oh, yes, but his act of agency.
There is no, I mean, there is just the choice.
Which he is producing.
But there is just the agent and the choice event, and possibly reasoning of the agent about the choice event, and then he just does it, and there is nothing that could be dated as beginning just a little bit before. There is just the agent that continues, and then there is a choice event that has no...
The time at which he just does it.
Yes.
Precede the time at which it occurs.
No, it's the same time.
Ah, well, that suggests simultaneous causation, and I think there are problems with simultaneous causation. I was going to have the last...
Right, okay.
About 12 o'clock. But briefly, if you... forgetting agency, but if you consider... If you take an event case or any case of suggested simultaneous causation, you have to, in any case, to understand causing something as bringing it about when it wasn't that way to start with, making a difference to things. Now, if it's making a difference to things, those things must be, as it were, in one state before you act, and in a different state as a result of your act. Now, if that's right, then there can't be simultaneous causation, because the effect, there will, for any period during which the cause acts, the effect will already be in that state. And therefore, the cause won't be making any difference to it.
But I agree with that only for event causation. And a choice event doesn't have a cause of that kind. A choice event has only, in another sense, you can call the agent cause of it, but the agent doesn't have a time, and it can't be said that the agent begins before it. And the action, there is nothing that could be called the action that is distinct from the choice event, and that could begin before the choice event. There is just the agent, and somewhere it has to start. Somewhere there has to be the first event, and that's brought about by the agent.
There are some cases where the agent tries to do something,
yes,
fails. There seems to be an act of agency here, but no effect. So I don't think, and you can date that. So I don't think that must have a date, and it would be obviously surprising if the only things that an agent did that had a date were his unsuccessful attempts.
Yeah, either we say choice events are tryings, that's one way to go, and the other way is to go that in trying simultaneously choice events occur.